Welcome to the Stoa and welcome to Meta Productivity. So I see a lot of familiar faces and familiar names. If you'd like, you can turn on your cameras and we can make this a little bit more personal because we got a pretty intimate group today. And I appreciate all the responses. Something about blasting pigeons with a power washer. I see a few weekly reviews. And getting the general sense that people here have a sense about productivity systems and things like that. But let me just launch into it. We got a few things to cover today. I don't think we'll need the full 90 minutes. I think we can get it through in an hour. But let's get started. All right, so everyone can hear me and see me well. They see a slide saying meta productivity. Great. Okay. So I'm just going to talk for a little bit, and then this is going to become more interactive for the second half. But just to set the stage, this is a mini series on this whole topic of productivity while staying thoughtful and examined. And I made up this like funny quote: "The unexamined productive life is not worth living." And if I were to summarize all of this, like this whole little experiment for the next 4 sessions in one slide, it would be this. Like you can just look at this slide, and if you leave now, then you kind of get the gist of what I'm doing here. Where basically, I noticed that there's this strange like dialectic between people who are very philosophical and thoughtful and examined, and then people who like actually get things done in the world. Now, this isn't always the case. This is obviously a simplification, but actually, let me just get a sense. Hands up or put a yes in the chat if you kind of get what I mean by this tension between these two poles. See hands up. Yes. So meta productivity is about this middle ground. And it's basically, how can we be thoughtful, examined, philosophically oriented, know the why, but also be really, really good at implementing the how and be exceptional achievers, basically. So this is about marrying these two questions in a way that ultimately I think leads to the original purpose of philosophy. But let me not get too ahead of myself. So first, why should you listen to me? I have a few reasons here. I think there are many reasons actually why you should listen to me. Some of the top ones are, I've actually been an executive productivity coach for the last 3 years, mostly working with C-suite in task management and personal knowledge management. So if you're familiar with David Allen's stuff and Tiago Forte's stuff, building a second brain, that's like my bread and butter. And that's what I teach people to set up. I've also been a mentor with Tiago's course 3 times. I've also been a product manager at a high growth tech company. And that means I take in a ton of inputs from people, and then I convert that into software through the outputs of other people. And basically that means I don't push code, I push people, but I'm overwhelmed on a regular basis with a ton of information. And then before that, my background was in behavioral science. So I actually worked at Dan Ariely's consulting firm. And we do things on behavioral change and habit design and things like that. So, those are some competence triggers or credentials, but honestly, I think the most important reason why you should listen to me is I've had a lot of personal struggle with that Venn diagram thing that I showed you in the beginning. That's kind of been the story of my life in a way. I think I was always a kid that couldn't help but negotiate everything. Like every day I'd wake up and everything would be up for grabs. I couldn't resist the deep existential questions. I had like existential crises at like a very early age. I was a world-class procrastinator in school. Like everybody thinks that they know how to procrastinate. I've never met anyone who procrastinated as much as I did. And so I had a lot of pain in this area of my life. And then it led into like a kind of strange career where I've now achieved some level of mastery in marrying those two worlds. So I believe I have something to share with everybody here. And I hope you feel the same way at the end of today. So my promise to you with this series is I'm going to share my raw thoughts on this. I'm going to keep it messy, make it personal, and I'm going to just tell you what I really believe. So a lot of this stuff is going to be a little bit experimental, but I really believe it's going to be highly valuable. I also want to be very practical. I think you have to dose concepts and practice in some optimal ratio. If it's just insights and like you're not actually doing anything, then I think it's kind of a waste of time. So each week we're going to do 1 or 2 practical exercises that are going to relate to the thing that I'm talking about. And then my request from everyone is tell me what you're struggling with. Send me DMs on Twitter, and just generally share blunt feedback on the parts that are confusing or interesting, so that can help me sculpt what I have to share in the coming weeks. And yeah, keep a conversation going in the chat if you're interested. All right, so that's the intro. Now I'm going to get into the presentation. And the presentation is really just about fleshing out this problem space a little bit better, and then hinting at potential solutions. Then we'll get into questions so I can get some feedback from everybody. And I imagine there's also a lot of wisdom in this room. I know a couple of you, so I know some of you have your own thoughtful answers. And then we're going to do a practice together that has to do with the solution that I have in mind. And that should take us to the end of the hour. So let's start. To set the stage and to get a sense of how everybody thinks about productivity, I want to ask you, what do you mean when you say, I had a productive day? So it's like, 8 p.m. or something, and you're reflecting on the last 12, 14 hours. If it's a productive day, what does that mean to you? And just drop the answer in the chat. Following through with my intentions. I like that one. I'll give everyone like a few seconds to do this, and then I'll share my answer. Ron, it's difficult to answer. Yeah. No downtime during the workday. It was work all the way through. Lots of to-do items checked off. Feeling spent in a good way. Wanting to do something and did it. Okay, so these kind of resonate with some of my working definitions. For me, productivity and the sense of feeling productive has to do with these three things. First, it's this experience of maintaining integrity. So somebody said completing their intentions. So integrity with your commitments, whether it's your personal promises to yourself or with other people. It's also, and this is kind of a newer thing, but remaining sovereign in the face of excessive open loops and information overload. So in our digital ecology, this is like a bigger issue. And so I want to highlight this. But if I were to just use one definition, it's moving the world in the direction you want to move it in. And so if each day you incrementally feel like things were moved closer to some direction you wanted to move it in, that feels like a productive day to me. And what's interesting with this definition is there's the moving of the world, and then there's this direction piece, direction you want to move it in. And I think that's the piece that is very confusing to a lot of people. Because if you don't know where you're going, then what's the point? So let's come back to this. I'm gonna grossly simplify this dialectic with two archetypes. So on one end, we have the hustler, and I'm gonna pick on Gary Vee here because I feel like he's a good example. I don't really know him, so maybe he's very thoughtful, but he represents the kind of like nose to the grindstone. Like if you're not like fully maximizing like every moment of your day, like you didn't have a good day type thing. And then we'll also say on this other end, there's the overthinker, and not all philosophers are overthinkers, but let's just like sharpen the poles of this spectrum to make it super clear. And the hustler might say, I actually think this is a direct quote, I have more hustle in this finger than Skittles has candy. And then on the overthinker side of the spectrum, we have people like asking questions like this every day. And this is a quote from Camus. And you can kind of see the pain that each of these people are signing up for, basically, in terms of their disposition to life. And what I would suggest is these are just two different variants of cope. You're either, and why cope, right? Cope because life is suffering. There's all these deep existential questions. There's the void. There's the fact that we're aging. Every year goes by, and you lose some of your potential. Everybody that you love is going to die one day. There's all these things you could be doing that you haven't been doing. You could just be better. And like most of us have this like background feeling of like angst that we kind of get accustomed to. In fact, this is something whenever I meditate, I start noticing it. It's just like always there. So the hustler copes by ignoring it and just focusing action and just moving things in the world. And the philosopher copes by spending a lot of time in the propositional space and asking the questions and wrestling with them, but at the expense of moving things in the world. So let's dive a little bit deeper. So I would say the need on the overthinker side is a practice or a system for actually getting their projects done. Because the tendency with that form of cope is you'll have this huge inbox of unpracticed insights, and they'll be really, really good. And you'll have really cool projects and really cool goals, but they will be largely unachieved. And that is painful. And then there's this other thing, which I've noticed is a lot of thoughtful people introduce needless chaos into their lives, like filing taxes late, like not getting health checkups, having a really disorganized world, and generally not having high fidelity in the physical environment. And so that's the pain point on the overthinker side. The hustlers, it's really about choosing better projects without losing their hustle. And I think there's this fear in some of the people that I've spoken to in my practice. They're kind of afraid of some of the deeper questions because they fear that it's going to mean that they're going to lose their edge, or they're going to realize the last decade was like kind of a waste of time. Like they were living somebody else's goals. And that is the failure mode on the hustler side. So they mindlessly pursue unexamined goals. They get recruited into the plans of others because they're very effective at doing things. And I add this third one, which is they have unconscious existential pain in the way that overthinkers might like have more conscious, like anxious existential pain. So I want to take a moment here to just have a quick like popcorn style dialogue with the people in the room, because it's a small group. And so you can share any insights that popped up from what I just presented, and also ask a couple of questions, and then I'll come back to the presentation. So I'm going to stop sharing right now. And we're small enough that feel free to unmute yourself and just say what comes up. And I'm also getting caught up on the chat here. Kevin. Oh, maybe not Kevin. So Peter, I liked your comment. You said to use Vervaekian language, the overthinker is coping with propositional knowledge, the hustler is coping with procedural knowledge. I like that.
I'm thinking about like if there's a possibility of being kind of a crossover between the two types. Like I think a lot of my issue is executive dysfunction, where like if I'm in someone else's flow, I can be very productive, but if it comes to making decisions for myself or like any kind of project for myself, I'm just a total overthinker and nothing happens at all.
Mm. So it's almost easier to achieve somebody else's vision over your own. Does that resonate with anybody else? Yeah. I'm with that for sure. Yeah. Let me hear one more share, and then I'll jump back in.
Yeah, what I've been noticing, I've been trying to use time blocking for my productivity. And when you asked earlier, like what defines a productive day for you, I almost feel like I need other people to feel productive. Like when I'm just in my own mode, no matter how many hours I spend dedicated to a project, I'm very acutely aware that most of that time is actually processing my feelings about that project and not actually getting anything done. And so even if I've spent 8 focused hours, I feel like very unsatisfied with that amount of time on a project, because, and I'm trying to figure out how to work with this. I'm trying to make more space for just like feeling is okay. But yeah, often when I come across an item in a project, like I'll spend several minutes just feeling and not actually moving anything forward. So anyways, that's some of what was coming up for me.
Zach, just a quick follow-up on that. How is it that when you have other people, how does that change? Like, what is it about the presence of other people that stops you from spending all that time on feelings?
I think just tuning into other people's process, like I can kind of plug into their rhythm around moving things forward. And yeah, I mean, I kind of honestly, it sort of feels like distraction, where like I just don't drop into my own sensation as much. And so I kind of coast on the surface just much more smoothly. Whereas when I'm, you know, kind of barricaded off in my zone, I can make really deep dives. And it seems like other people provide this kind of momentum where I just skip over those crevices.
Right. Yeah, I resonate with that actually. Thanks for sharing. Peter, you got your hand raised.
Yeah, Zach's share sparked something. Sort of like being recognized, this notion of being recognized, or feeling of being recognized for doing something. And you know, the whole thumos energy that I like to say, it's like just, it's the desire to be recognized for your most noble actions or self. And when I'm kind of trying to be productive myself out of a context of a mastermind group or some kind of like hustle thing, I'm less inspired to do it. But when I'm kind of doing it in front of other people, I get more inspired. And there's a sense of guilt there. Like, oh, I should be able to be this sort of like, you know, superstar on my own and without anyone knowing that I'm crushing it. So there's this tension there, but then there's this aspect like, oh no, fuck, the communal aspect does seem like a healthier approach. So yeah, there's a tension I feel there, but that's an observation that came up.
Yeah, and just to amplify that, so I'm glad we touched on this so soon, because the original title for this series was going to be collective productivity, not meta productivity, and that's part of like in keeping with the Stoa's nomenclature, but also because I really believe that there's an insight here about not trying to be an individual being productive, and just owning the fact that we work better when we're with people and not feeling guilty about it. And this is something Peter and I have talked about a lot elsewhere. So yeah, I'm glad we touched on that. So I'm gonna jump into like a very modest start of a solution to the tension that I presented, and then we're gonna go straight into an exercise. So if you have like a piece of paper or a pen, or you brought your to-do list, now's the time to kind of like bring it together. But you will have a chance to also create a to-do list if you don't have one. So I thought, like, if I were to really compress the solution into quotes for each of these archetypes, I would say this is actually from the Stoa. For the overthinkers, you don't need a to-do list, you need to clean your toilet. I just love this quote so much. And David Allen said it at the Stoa, and I think he said it off the cuff. I don't think this is something that like was premeditated. And the idea here is, you know, I've hinted at all these systems, like building a second brain, personal knowledge management, getting things done. And the problem with the overthinker type is that that'll also end up being something that stands in the way of them actually moving things in the world. Because you can read about productivity, like a big failure mode there is that you just become a productivity nerd that doesn't actually do anything. It's kind of like an academic philosopher who's not a practitioner. And so I love this, like clean your toilet, because that's like a very like visceral, like physical thing to do, but it's also a metaphor in my mind for the shit that you're avoiding. For hustlers, the main advice is where your head is more important than how fast you're getting there. And if you were to really summarize like all productivity practice, like what does it mean to like be more productive? It's actually focusing on the right tasks. So if someone's super efficient on the wrong tasks, they're actually very unproductive. And that's why like I don't think of hustlers as productive, you know, if we're trying to redeem the word productivity, which is kind of like a weird term anyway. So it's the direction that's really important, and that's where inquiry comes in. But I think for the purposes of our group, it might be more valuable to focus a little bit on this overthinking side of the spectrum, because there are a lot of thoughtful people in the Stoa. It doesn't mean that they're unproductive. It's just, I think there's a different, unique set of challenges for people who are very meta, basically. And I was trying to summarize, like, why is it that thoughtful people struggle with productivity? What's like the actual like TLDR? I think it has to do with this thing about constraints. The more thoughtful you are, the more you tend to negotiate constraints. And to get anything done, you need constraints. And I've noticed with the people that have coached that there's a resistance to accepting given constraints. So, you know, with your employer, let's say, or with some sort of like academic program that you're in, and it's very hard to accept artificial constraints that aren't like well designed. And so I've come up with a few tactics that have helped me. And also, the more people have felt that I'm like an epistemic peer, like, oh, this guy gets my challenges, the more they're willing to accept the constraints that I give them. And I don't know if I've necessarily earned that with anyone here, but if you just play along with what I'm about to show you, I think there might be something valuable here. So I wanted to share this core concept because I want to give like a useful insight that might be new to people. And then we're going to get into the practice. Has anyone ever seen anything like this before, this representation of the life cycle of a project? Okay, I think this is kind of novel for a lot of people. If you're in the design space, you'll see this kind of thing. I took this from Tiago's course, Building a Second Brain, but this is not his idea. This is all over the place. But basically, whenever there's a project that you want to achieve, you know, let's say putting together a PowerPoint deck, or even something like, you know, filing your taxes, there's this final deliverable where it's like hyper constrained and real, and all the potential has been actualized into something concrete like the PowerPoint deck. And then there's this starting point where you're just not there yet. And in between, there's this dance between divergence and convergence. So in the beginning of the project, you actually don't know yet what you're doing. So you start into it and everything starts to diverge. And everyone's familiar with this, where there's like a point where you're working on something, especially something long-term, where you don't even know what you're doing anymore because there's so many possibilities now. And we have like notes all over the place. And like the scope of it has gotten huge. And that's one of the risks of diverging too much. And then you also have the other risk where people just do things that are very uninspired, right? So they don't have too much divergence and they stay like super converged. And yeah, they get the final deliverable, but it's like, it's kind of dull and uninspired and doesn't really connect with them. And so there's always going to be this dance where you need some divergence, but then there's an optimal stopping point where you need to start converging again. And I think constraints and the thoughtful use of constraints is the name of the game here, basically. If you're very thoughtful and meta and philosophically oriented, then you're probably going to diverge a lot. And a lot of your productivity issues are going to be from this whole thing blowing up so much that you don't actually get to the final deliverable. And that becomes demoralizing, and there's like cascades and stuff like that. And that's why, you know, some of the stuff that you've shared so far, you know, people saying that they can get more done when it's other people's vision. That's because you're getting the constraint from somebody else and you're not now responsible for renegotiating it. You can put the negotiation stuff off to the side and actually start converging. And it's the same when you're working with people. People force constraints upon you. So this is a huge topic, and there's a bunch of different practices that can be applied to this this whole like life cycle of a project. And so I thought I'd introduce the highest leverage ones. This is stuff that I do on a weekly basis, and we're going to do that together now. So we're going to get into an activity, and I think for now, as long as you have like a piece of paper in front of you or a Google Doc, then you're all ready to follow along. But if you also already have a to-do list, then you can reference that. And the first part of this activity is that I call this a 5-minute dash. The first part is we're going to list all the things that we're avoiding. So like anything that's on your mind, like it could be with regards to work, it could be your relationships, it could be your personal finances, it could be your personal projects that you've been neglecting. And what I recommend for this step is just write it in the terms that they arise. Like, let's say you're supposed to you had an argument with your sister and you feel like you need to like talk to her or something this week. Just write sister if that's like the word that comes up. Don't overthink how to frame it. So we're going to do that. I'm going to set a timer for about 5 minutes where we do that. And then next, we're going to go through this list and bold the top 3 hairiest items. So we're just capturing right now, and then we're prioritizing. And then there's a few more steps that I'll get to in a sec, but I'm going to do this piecemeal. So does anyone have any questions? Any clarifications on this? If I can get a thumbs up, then I'll start the timer, and I'm going to do this as well. I got my my notes here. Okay, everyone seems clear. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to set a 5-minute timer, and then I will interrupt us when it's done. So again, just for now, for the 5 minutes, actually, you know what? Just for the 5 minutes, just list the things. Don't worry about bolting it. Okay. Just list a bunch of stuff. We got about 2 minutes left, but if anyone's done or like completely stuck, just write that in the chat so I get a sense of where you're at. All right, does anyone really need more time? No, okay. I'm going to, I thought it'd be interesting if I actually just show you my list, and then I'll demonstrate the next step of the project or the activity. So this is what I did. And a lot of these terms probably won't mean anything to you, but they mean a lot to me. And this is just the way like this stuff came out of my head. The idea with this first step, by the way, is if you just put a timer and just start like dumping things, eventually, usually for me, it's like once I'm 2 minutes into it, it's almost like something like unlocks and then more stuff starts to pour out, especially if you haven't done this in a while. So the next step is just to look at your list and bold the top 3 hairiest items, because we're going to take those and move them to the next step. So for instance, this, let me see. And this, those are the ones. And how did I go about doing that? Honestly, it's just intuitive. Like you get a feeling like if these were crossed off my list, or if I knew what I was going to do next on them, I just like feel good, or it would open up energy. Or if you want to be more systematic, you can say what item, if you were to complete, would make everything else like seem easy. So do that now. And then just write done when you bolded your 3 items, and then I'll switch to the next step. Yeah, and if you're writing by hand, then just like underline it or put a star next to it or something. All right, while the dones are coming in, if anyone feels stuck or has a question, now's the time where you can unmute before I move to the next thing. John.
Yeah. So there was something that you just said just now about opening up more energy. And I'm curious about the relationship of getting into the hustle and having things that are lingering that need to be processed that kind of weigh you down. But then just like, there might be times where there's a lot of stuckness to having that thing resolved. How does one play around with that kind of dynamic in their work?
I'm not sure exactly what you're asking, but some little model that has helped me a lot with this like feeling of stuckness or energy being trapped until you start addressing it is, it's almost like there's like a veil in your mind, like in your psyche, and the things that, when I say like what's something you've been avoiding, it's the shit that you throw behind that veil kind of habitually over time, because every time you think about it, there's like some unpleasant emotion. And so there's energy being devoted to like keep it out of mind. And as soon as you like bring it up, you're going to feel that like short-term negative emotion. But it's especially as soon as you start addressing it, then you're no longer spending energy on avoiding it. And I've personally found, like, it's so weird, but I remember when I first really felt this, it was like many years ago, I was resisting sending an email about something related to my career. And I sent the email and it took like 5 minutes to do it. And then I felt like energy just coursing through my body right after sending that email. And then I got like 50 other things done right after it. So I know a lot of people have had that experience. That's the idea here. All right, we got a bunch of dones. So I'm going to go into the next step. And don't worry if you don't feel confident about the items that you've bolded. That's fine. You can always get better at this across time. So, okay, the next step is we're going to do something called the 3-column exercise. So we're going to take that the number 1 item from that bold list. So we started with 3, and then there's this question, which one of these, if completed, would make all the other ones easier or give you the most relief? Or which one of these have you been avoiding the most? So I want you to pick one item that you've bolded, and then we're going to go through this separate page and create 3 columns on it. And I'm going to show you what this looks like. Actually, I think, yeah. So we're going to do this. We're gonna write, just so draw like 2 lines and then write the task's name. And then I'll explain what to do with these 2 variables next, but we're just taking one of those items and we're going to write it down, and we're going to do this exercise with it. So this is called the 3-column exercise. And this goes back to David Allen's book on GTD. And if I were to say, like, what is like the Miyagi, like wax on, wax off, like fundamental basic move of productivity, it's this exercise. So I put the examples up here, but basically, let's say your first item, your top item was file my taxes. And that's what you write in the first column. And in the second column, you write your ideal outcome. Like, what would it look like if this was done? Like, it's now out of my mind and there's no residue. And I wrote a little sentence here. It's like, I've submitted my 2021 taxes to the CRA with high confidence that I did it correctly. So there's like a kind of like a concrete thing here, like something's been submitted, but there's also an emotional quality too, where I'm confident that I did it right. So that would be ideal. And the final step is this is kind of the hardest one, but we're going to write the next physical action. And the key word here is physical. And just to give you an example of like how interesting this can be, the next physical action for this one would have been open Google Chrome and log into Wealthsimple, which is like this tool for filing your taxes. If I didn't pause to think about the next physical action, I wouldn't have assumed it was open Google Chrome. I would have thought like something vague about like receipts or something like that, or something vague about like emailing an accountant. Like, it would have just been this like cloud of stuff. And it's that cloud of stuff that leads to procrastination and ambiguity and that lack of constraint that to get things done. So maybe you've started doing this as I've been describing it, but let's just take a moment now to fill out these 3 variables. So you already have this from the previous step. And now we're going to write the ideal outcome for if this was like completely done, like you're not thinking about it anymore because it's done. And then once you've done that, we'll get to the next physical action. Any questions about this? Some people struggle with this one. So if it feels weird, confusing, that's like totally fair. Okay, I see people writing. And again, when you're done, just type in done, and then I want to hear some examples. So only if you're comfortable sharing, but we're just going to start getting better at like the pattern recognition of these things. All right, I only see a couple dones. Does that mean if anyone's stuck, then write a stuck? Okay, more dones are coming in. All right, so I'm going to share what I did, and then I want to hear examples from two people so that we really lock this in. So I picked this one, and the thing that I've been avoiding is I've had a bunch of personal training sessions, and my trainer is very he's kind of like a disorganized person, so he doesn't like invoice me. So it's up to me to find out how much I owe him, and he also like doesn't remind me. He's just like not in that headspace at all. So that means sometimes like weeks and weeks go by, and I'm like, oh, I owe this guy money, and I don't know how much I owe him. And so this is like a perfect kind of task that like irritates me, and like this is like classic Daniel avoidance task, because it means I have to like, it involves money, it involves like something menial, it involves something that I feel like I shouldn't be doing because like he should be doing it. It's like perfect. So the outcome is I know the exact dollar amount for my outstanding training sessions with Andrew with complete confidence. And I noticed, by the way, as I wrote this, that I was tempted to say I paid him, but then I realized that's actually not the ideal outcome for this task. And in fact, I don't want to like introduce that scope yet. I just want to know how much I owe him now. So by framing the outcome like that, I started to get a little bit more, the project became less intimidating. Because if I went to, I'm going to pay him, then I'm thinking about like, wait, now I have to think about like my personal finances in a way that like I didn't really sign up for yet. And then that's why you start avoiding these types of tasks. Because, you know, maybe I'm not on top of my budget this month or something, and like there's more resistance that's contaminating this task. You start to notice these things when you're forced to frame the outcome. And then the next physical action, this is literally it. It's like to open this Google Sheet, which it's a spreadsheet, and I just like linked it here alongside your text message history, and then start date matching your last few training sessions. Because I realized like, yep, I got to like go through and find out what sessions that we actually have, and then I have to like list them. And you can see it's like, you know, kind of like a tedious thing to do, but that's the next physical action. So before I hear some examples, I want to highlight something here. This is like a digital thing. And more our lives are digital. So the physical action of like opening a Google Sheet is actually very, very similar physically to like opening up YouTube or opening up your email inbox or whatever. So we lack some of that, the physically distinguishing characteristics that I think could lead to someone having like a little bit more flow in terms of how they do things in their life, in proportion to how much of our lives and our work becomes digital. This is like an important insight. I think we have like a unique set of challenges now because so much of life is digital. And I think that leads to different types of failure modes for productivity and procrastination. So it's just something I noticed. And also, if you have like 50 Google Sheets, then the physical experience of like choosing one versus the other doesn't feel very different. It becomes more and more conceptual. Yeah, I think that's the last thing I'll say about that. But I want to hear two examples from other people before I go to the final step. And if you don't want to share verbally, you can also just paste it in the chat, and I think that'll be sufficient. Also, did anyone find that last section kind of challenging to do? Like, especially the physical action side of it? Or are you all wizards already? If anyone thinks they have like a really, they did it poorly, I'd love to see that as well, and then I can give you some feedback. But I'm going to keep us on time, so if I'll just give like another 30 seconds for people to decide if they want to share. Nathan, why was it tough?
Okay, I'll share. Um, the next physical action was tough because I felt like it could have diverged into kind of anything. So, for example, I picked a simple one. My task is to expand my garden because I bought all of these seeds, I prepped it all, I did all of this stuff, and then I kind of sat on it. I only planted a few things. And so the outcome was to have everything planted that's on my list because I made a checklist. And so the next physical action part was the toughest because if I do what I'm supposed to do by expanding the garden, that opens up like sort of the backyard part to what it's supposed to be, which is like a flower bed or whatever. But it could also open up a bunch of other things that I need to do that is kind of downstream of expanding the garden sort of thing. And so the next physical action was just to go buy garden soil, like physically drive to the nursery to go get it. So
it's interesting because that action seems like it's probably like a decent one, or it's like decently correct, but a lot of it depends on what the actual outcome is. Like, how do you define done? And
Sure.
You had an interesting one because your done criteria was a list of things that you wanted to plant. If you totally just stuck to that list, then that's pretty discrete. But what I'm hearing is then it started opening up like other potential projects, right?
Right. Correct. Yeah.
So one way to deal with that is you create more tasks basically with their own outcomes. Yeah, cool. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. Thanks.
Katie or Caddy, I don't know if that's the pronunciation. Do you want to share more about your task and outcome in next physical action?
Sure, it's Katie. The task I chose as the hairiest right now was to create a graphic and web design portfolio and website. The outcome was probably the most difficult for me to define on this one because, okay, so what I wrote down is that I want to have a portfolio website that I feel proud of, that I enjoy looking at aesthetically and is functional in terms of like a sales funnel. And like, I want to have, I think that's where the scope gets a little bit difficult, is like, okay, how much of like the process or like new client intake do I want to integrate into the site before I consider it done? Yeah, the next physical action I put was to open my little Telegram chat that I have with myself of notes to myself and go through the past 2 months of just like visual inspiration that I pulled and plot that into a Google Doc where I can look at all of it at once.
Do you mind if I dialogue with you a bit on this?
Sure.
So what's the most important part of the website? Is it demonstrating your previous work, or is it having a sales funnel?
It's hard to separate those two. I would say demonstrating ability to produce well.
So the one way to artificially separate it is if you could only have one, if you had like a sales funnel with no.
I would much rather just have the portfolio that demonstrates previous work. Yeah.
Cool. Because to me, those could be two projects, and then totally separating them might make it a little bit easier to find out what to do. I don't know if that helps at all, but I just find like sometimes we couple things that we don't necessarily need to couple.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the final step, I don't think everyone's going to be able to do this. I don't think Nathan will, because you got to get into a car. But basically, once you have this kind of definition with the columns, the whole idea is like, don't just like frame a project. Never leave the framing or planning of a project without taking action. That's basically the principle. And what I've learned is that, like, basically at any time of my life, I can always do 5 minutes on something. You know, even like if I'm running late, like there's always like something that I can do. So I used this practice for a while called the 5-minute dash, where I would just like take everything that we just isolated, you know, the hairiest problem, the outcome, the next physical action, and then set a timer for 5 minutes and work as like manically and as fast as I possibly can on that project, and like do it right away. It's as simple as that. There's like nothing profound to it other than like you just set the timer and then you do it. So what I want to do now is just do that. So I'm going to set a 5-minute timer, and then you take your task and just go on it. And if your task is like getting into a car and going somewhere, then maybe pick something else. And if you're like if you pick something else and you don't even know what the next physical action is, then still do the 5-minute dash, because it might be a forcing function to help you realize what to do next. So let's get started. 5 minutes starting now. All right. Stop. Completely stop. Just drop it. Like, even if you're in the middle of something, you have to stop. And let's just chat for a second as I close. Okay. How was that for everyone? I'd love to hear someone share their experience or put something in the chat, and then I'm going to share some thoughts about this. Very nice, fun, super cool. Did anyone like get their thing done in the 5 minutes? Okay, does anyone have any reflections on how they feel about the hairy thing that they just worked on? Surprisingly significant progress. Zach feels overwhelmed. Okay, I'm just going to say my final closing thing, and then we'll call it. So the idea with this is it's a constraint, right? We were talking about constraints earlier. This is a time constraint. It's 5 minutes. As soon as you constrain the time, you have to constrain a bunch of other things. And one thing that's like really helped me with this is I'll even like try to convince myself that I am actually going to be like submitting this project at the end of the 5 minutes. Like I'll low key put that pressure on myself. So I'll be like, if I have a presentation to do, I'll be like, all right, the deck is going to be done in 5 minutes, go. And then I just like work as fast as I can. And what's so crazy is that like half the time I'll actually finish the thing in the 5 minutes. And it'll be things that I thought were going to take me, like 2 hours or something like that. So this is the topic of constraints. This is like the simplest one you can use at any time. And I would say, the 3-column exercise, it's really useful to do that, especially if you feel like you really don't know where to start with something. But when in doubt, just go straight to the 5-minute dash. Like as soon as the task comes up in your mind, set a 5-minute timer and then run for it. But there's one really important caveat to this, which is you 100% have to stop at the 5-minute mark. I don't care how you feel. I don't care if you want to keep going. I don't care if you're almost done. You have to stop. You have to stop and go do something else. Go do something fun. You can come back to it. You can take like a 5-minute break and come back to it. But the whole idea is you want to train yourself to actually honor the constraint. And then it starts to become something that you can deploy with enough self-trust. You just know that you're not going to dupe yourself. You're not going to say, all right, I'll start 5 minutes and then takes you 5 hours. And I just want to introduce like some kind of like conceptual backbone to this. There's something called the Zeigarnik effect, which for the purposes of productivity, basically it's something about the way the brain handles incomplete tasks. It's when you start a task, you're more likely to complete it because your brain creates an open loop. And that creates like this predictive set of expectations that are now like running there, trying to be complete. So you naturally will find yourself gravitating more to the task, even if it was something that previously you really avoided. And I think everybody knows this intuitively. I put this little ice emoji here because to me, it's all about like breaking the ice. And if you break the ice with a 5-minute dash, then often you'll find yourself coming back to it. And if not, if like some projects, they require like quite a lot of wrestling, I'll deploy a few of these 5-minute dashes, and then eventually that's enough to break the ice, and then you hit flow and then you go through with it. So I'm going to stop there. That's the activity I wanted to share with everybody because I feel like when it comes to my personal practice of productivity, those two things are the things that have changed my life the most. There's a bunch of other stuff too, like how do you do this across time? How do you externalize all of this into a system that's scalable, et cetera? And that's stuff we can talk about in the coming weeks. But that's all I had in store for session 1. So if you have any questions, or you want to share any thoughts, I'm going to stay on for another few minutes. But otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Sunday.